have to clue each other. Okay, now this, now that. We didn't rehearse. All right, so please know that all
Unlike usually, I got to mention, unlike usually, we are often very well rehearsed. We practice these classes 3 or 4 times before we unpack them for you guys. We just want to let you know that.
Yes. Okay, so please know that all video conference sessions are recorded and archived. During these sessions, the typical expectations of our classroom and our school apply. This tool is only to be used while the teacher is present. No part of this session is to be recorded or redistributed by any student. All right, so Mr. Chisnell made me aware of the fact that you all have today and next week as your year of TOK. So yikes, we have a lot to think about before next week's class. But our hope is that we're going to go away for the summer with a plan in mind for one of the 2 TOK assessments. Okay, so no, don't be panicked. They don't seem that worried, nor should they. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the TOK presentation, and we are actually going to be offering those presentations as soon as we get back, whatever that looks like. Some schools right now, their 11th grade group does the presentation in the 11th grade year, and so they're doing them via video conference. So should we have some kind of scenario like that, we know that other schools have already done it that way. We're still crossing our fingers that everything looks more normal, but we are going to have plans in place, so any scenario we'll be able to get you through. So today we're going to unpack what it is, what the presentation is, and this is the place where I asked Mr. Chisnell. Mr. Chisnell, are you available to show Matt's presentation?
Sure.
Okay. So what we were thinking about in our hours of preparation is that we would have you take a look at a presentation. We're going to start with the end in mind. So you're going to look at this student presentation. I don't know exactly what the grade is. I know it's not the top grade, but I also know it's not the lowest grade. But what I want you to do is use your powers of inquiry and just notice. You might want to take some notes. What does the student seem to be doing that seems interesting? And also, what can you glean from his presentation? What can you glean are the objectives of the task itself? Okay, and so we're going to sort of work backwards. Take a look, see what you notice, and then we'll sort of unpack it after we watch his presentation.
And if it's okay, Miss Barnett, we'll do this in pieces. Like maybe we'll watch the first 3 or 4 minutes.
Perfect.
Then take a pause. Because I think he does something in the first 3 or 4 minutes that's worth chatting about. So I know I need to change my audio to the
So, as some of you may know, my first RLS is going to be surrounded around our friend Yvonne here.
What?
And it came into play when one day we were walking at TOK together and no one else was in the room. I started thinking about that painting in the back there. You'll see it's got some nice little sunflowers on it, a little bit of brightness, you know, it's got that kind of a like cold, coolish kind of color background. And I asked her, I was like, what do you think the mood of the painting is? First time she looked at me kind of weird, she was like, okay, but then she kind of started to like, she looked at it, gears were turning in her head, and she's like, it's sad. And I was like, okay, I see where you're going here. Now, what mood are you in right now? And this is where it's kind of starting to kick her. She's like, sad. And so then, from there, I immediately started to to kind of make a correlation between the mood that she felt and the mood that she sees. And it got me thinking. I started thinking about how our emotions can change what we know and how we know it, which eventually led me to the knowledge question. To what extent can emotion alter the verification of knowledge? Some of the questions that came up from the situation with our Yvonne in the painting is Yvonne's emotion altering how she sees the painting? Does being sad have an impact on her viewing the painting as sad? And then from here, I kind of started thinking a more broad kind of application. I came up with a question. Does any emotion we feel at any time impact how we verify knowledge in other situations? So almost similar to how Yvonne would view the painting and have a sad mood. I was wondering if maybe even myself, if I had a particular mood at the time, if I felt scared or worried, and then I saw like a good example actually would be some of the Rorschachs. If you know what they are, those are like psychological kind of illustrations, and they're like ink blotches, and if you view them, you're supposed to see certain things. So if I was in a particularly scared or frantic state, and I was looking at something that almost represented a face, and I was like, I see a monster, I see something scary, it kind of got me thinking about maybe my emotion and how I feel is impacting how I could see that. So then I started to think about how love and romance are also very powerful emotion evokers, and I wondered how knowledge could be altered, if at all, in a situation of romance, which eventually led me to my second RLS, which is Beyonce being cheated on by Jay-Z, but she's still staying with him because she makes him happy. Now, this situation shows what I thought was an interesting concept. The fact that Beyonce's personal knowledge of her own relationship and emotions far exceed anything that I had thought about the relationship. Because when I started thinking about this, it kind of left me a little frazzled. I was like, dude, I would totally break up with someone if they cheated on me. But that's my personal knowledge. So when I look at that situation, she knows more about her own relationship and her own experiences. She has more knowledge about this event than I do. So whatever I think at the time is just it's in the back of my mind. But what was most interesting about this situation was how emotions played into this, and how she was happy in this situation. She was happy in this relationship. So maybe that emotion was influencing her to keep being in the relationship, or to keep striving to reach that happiness, to hold on to something that she had loved.
Hopefully you were able to hear that a little bit. Hopefully you can hear me now. Okay, good. All right. So I guess the opening question is going to be something like this. What did you see Matt doing here? What is the nature of this presentation? What is he trying to accomplish? What's his main question?
I think his main question was like, how does your mood affect how you perceive something else?
Yeah. And he framed it pretty much that way too, as a knowledge question, right? Have we all talked about the phrase knowledge question? Do we know what those are? Okay. So this is where it becomes a really important part of the assessment, is, as Caitlin suggests, how does mood affect our knowledge? And I think that's where the knowledge question comes in. He says, to what extent do one's emotions impact their knowledge of the broader world? And I think, he starts with an art question, but and that's the RLS that we've talked about. So you've seen at the beginning the first, and I would say fundamental gesture or strategy of this assessment. Start with an RLS and see what knowledge question emerges from it. at least which one you want to pursue and explore, right? Hopefully, when Matt does this presentation, we'll hear more about that Yvonne looking at the flower painting and make sense of what is the mood of that painting for real? Can it be known? And what's the nature of knowledge that's derived from emotion, right? Now let's think about it this way. He added the Beyonce question. Can you thinking of the knowledge question, to what extent do our emotions affect our knowledge of reality or the external world? Can you think of other situations where that might be the case? Other real life situations that you might use to investigate that question?
I think emotion comes up a lot in like when we're studying politics. I think when we're looking at like different parties and their views and what is believable and what isn't, I think that our emotions about the people that are in those parties and what we feel about those issues, I think that comes up a lot. And I think that that can skew our knowledge about very big issues.
That's a really interesting parallel that you've raised. And I like it because it comes from a very different AOK, right? Where Yvonne looking at the painting is more like just a personal knowledge example of art. You bring it over into the human sciences and suggest that there's a similar concern happening there. Do we see, to keep with Allie's example, do we see the idea of Yvonne reading the painting and say any of us reading a political figure as being the same or different? In what ways are those examples similar or different from each other in terms of how emotion works in our knowledge making? Or are they identical? Ted Cruz and a Monet, same thing. Emma's thinking about something.
They're definitely not the same, because when it comes to art, it's a lot more emotional and drawing in the eye with visual and color for cues. So if you look at a color scheme or the rhythm of a painting, you have a lot more idea of like the mood of the painting, like in the example. But with politics, as far as I know, it's about facts and like basing facts on opinion and past history. So I don't think that you can say politics and art are the same thing, because they're both social constructs in a sense, but you don't go about them the same way.
Interesting.
I don't know.
There's a lot I could say about that, but I want to see if anyone else would like to add on to Emma's idea or dispute it. Emma, I'm sorry to interrupt you. If I summarize your point, would it be safe to say that the essence of your point is that art is intended to be read, or knowledge is intended to be created through emotion, at least in part, and politics knowledge isn't assembled from emotion per se? It's not supposed to be anyway. So if if different AOKs or different real life situations in those AOKs have different ways to build knowledge, are you disagreeing with Allie that we look at Ted Cruz and say, I don't like that man, and are we saying that's wrong? You shouldn't do that? Or am I allowed to look at the color of Ted Cruz's tie and his mismatched suit or his poorly tailored suit and say, you know, he just doesn't do it for me. I read him like an artwork. Frankly, I don't know how Ted Cruz got into this, but that's okay. Matt, in his presentation, raises Beyonce and says she decides to stay with her husband even though he cheated on her. What area of consideration is this? Is it natural sciences there, or is that something else? It's not art. I mean, Beyonce's an artist, but we're not talking about art there. What are we reading or building knowledge from there? Are you already sensing what the challenge of this presentation is going to be? I don't know if you can see it. Here's a little bit about what Beyonce is about. Matt acknowledges it as a personal knowledge. Beyonce has personal knowledge, but there's an ethics issue in there too, isn't there? Does marriage insist upon fidelity? I don't know. But the question isn't so much about Beyonce's marriage as what role should emotions play in this? Suppose we say Beyonce has agreed to forgive her husband for cheating, and that's her business. And so we wash our hands of it and say her personal knowledge and her ethical framework gets to keep it the same, and we don't have to think about it anymore. She gets to stay in her marriage. Good for her. Now suppose the same situation's going on, Beyonce and her husband, except it's a domestic abuse situation. Do you reason it the same way? Her emotions tell her, I'm going to stay in the marriage. Do we say, you go, girl, those are your emotions?
No, of course not.
Okay, good, absolutely. So now Caitlin knows that I'm going to ask her to follow up with that. You knew I was going to.
I know. I mean, there's a different factor in there. Obviously, I mean, I don't know, because in like the actual situation, she loves her, and I mean, he probably hurt her more emotionally, but she's willing to forgive him that way since it was more of an emotional trauma. Whereas physically, if he hurt her, then and she still wanted to stay with him, it just doesn't make sense to anybody or the public, because no matter what, then your emotions, you can't let your emotions take over in that.
So you're telling me that emotions have a limit to how far they should be permitted to impact our knowledge.
Yeah, I think so.
and that some emotions can be damaging.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're getting at close to what the heart of this presentation is about, is to try to explore the parameters, the how of knowledge making operates. Matt's question is, to what extent do emotions impact our knowledge making, right? Basically, is what he's asking. The follow-up question that has got to be, or the follow-up questions that have to be, in positive or negative ways. Healthy, permissible, non-permissible. What other factors get involved? Allie says emotions impact politics. Emma says they shouldn't. Who's right there?
Well, I think they're both kind of right. So I think emotions do affect politics, whether depending on how big or small the scale is or what the situation is. Maybe emotions can help you and should affect it in a positive way, or maybe you totally shouldn't let it affect your politics because then you're being whatever hypocritical or not making sense. So I think there's a limit, like we were saying, there's a limit to how much you can let your emotions affect something.
Mm-hmm. If you were going to pursue this, and this is where the presentation goes, is you start with an RLS of some kind, just like Matt did, and then you form a knowledge question from that. So really what happens is the RLS that you start with becomes the diving board for the big knowledge question. It gets you launched. And then your presentation now is going to try to figure out all the answers and permutations of this knowledge question you can. And that's where the challenge is. Along the way, you're going to have to probably look at other RLSs to try to make sense of them. You might, in order to understand the art question, you might have to look at a politics question to say, no, wait a minute. Maybe it's okay in art, but maybe it's not in human sciences. Or maybe it's less so, more so in personal knowledge cases, but only up to an ethical moment or an ethical point. Maybe in some cases you say, this is really healthy. Matt brought up the Rorschach tests. And maybe it's in some point where you're supposed to, through psychology, also a human science, that maybe through psychology, you're supposed to use your emotions, and it's a conditioning and processing of emotions and understanding how emotions make knowledge that the psychologist is after. Here's the important part. It's going to get messy, and it should. If Allie folded her arms and said, look, politics is all about image making and emotional appeal, and as long as you can look pretty on camera, you get the votes, period, done, over. The facts don't matter. If Emma kind of flipped Allie off in that process and said, no, we should do close analysis of all these things, the positives and negatives, and broke it down into these binaries and said, this is how we should rate it, then we should all know what we want based upon our ethical values, period, done. Each of them is, with those arguments, missing the complexity of the argument, right? Seeing Caitlin start to wrestle with some of the subtopics underneath that, that's closer to the meat of what this presentation has to be, is to try to figure out what is the role of these different ways of knowing in these areas of knowledge. And as Matt framed in his knowledge question, how does it affect verification of knowledge? Now, what's important about his presentation there, and I could show you the rest of it, but it's another 10 or 11 minutes, and we don't have a lot of time to do that. What's important about what he does is he goes after that term verification, one of our TOK terms. He goes after that term verification to try to say, if I'm trying to decide if my mathematical proof is legitimate or not, do my emotions have any value at all? Do they have any value in science? Am I allowed to smile in satisfaction if I discover something? Can I allow that satisfaction or that frustration impact my methodology? That gets complicated. And we may decide in some AOKs it's really important to have, in other places it's not. In the end, you may or may not have a conclusion about your knowledge question. But one thing's for sure, you will certainly have explored the hell out of it. You'll have dug at it from a bunch of different directions, tested out some different examples, and played with it to see what you could uncover. And if you've done well, you've done two big things. One, you've shown us that you're thinking all the time about this. Hopefully, that you're thinking about this through the TOK terms. But at least you're thinking about it. So I'm less interested in Tyler's research that he's going to do around this presentation than I am his thinking about the research in terms of knowledge making. The second thing that's ideal is that you discover something that you haven't thought before. So that might be a question you've never imagined asking before. It might be a conclusion that you've settled on that you feel confident about or less than confident about, but you want to state anyway. But it's something that you have not maybe thought before, that your investigation leads you to something that teaches you. You pull off those two things, you've made a pretty good presentation. All the rest of the things that Ms. Barnett and I are going to tell you along the way are just procedures, just rules on how to get there, strategies. Start with a real life situation, get to a knowledge question. Pursue that knowledge question, just rip it to shreds and find out where you can go with it. Talk about your thinking, show us where you end up. You win. Questions so far? By the way, when you were watching Matt, did you notice that he was very well rehearsed and he had practiced his presentation many times, so it was perfectly polished and memorized? Or did you notice it another way?
It felt like it came easy to him, but it didn't feel like it was totally perfectly rehearsed. It just felt like he was having a conversation.
Yeah. The good news about the presentation is there are no marks for the quality of your speaking. There's no points given for whether you stumble, trip, blubber, or drool. So if you get up in front of us and just kind of have a meltdown, which, by the way, one of my students in cohort 1 did the first time. And then we said, okay, come on back again later and do it for us again. And we'll give you the better of the two. We don't care about your presentation style. What we care about is you having a conversation with us TOK style. Now, Matt didn't use any visual aids, but you certainly can. Most of my students in the last group did visual aids. They did like some PowerPoint, or some of them, one or two of them had physical objects that they brought in to talk about. One had a short video that they showed, very short. So it's up to you if you want to bring those things in. If they're helpful, that's great. But if you just want to sit down and have a conversation with us, If you want to ask the audience or the class questions, Matt does at the end, which chews up his time. But anyway, if you want to do that, you can do that. If you want to make Tyler stand up and turn circles and try to make some knowledge question out of that, by all means do so. The floor is totally yours for the roughly 10 minutes that you have to do this whole caboodle. You're allowed to bring up anything you want, notes, scripts, computers, your pet poodle. There's no restrictions at all. They strongly recommend that you not read your presentation. The recommendation is that you talk to us about your thinking. And we want to hear you just kind of spontaneously talk and present whatever notes you have. But if you're reading a ton of stuff, if you're reading a script, you've misunderstood what we're doing here. Okay, where's your big terror so far? So far, so good? Miss Barnett, I think you've got some agenda in our heads. I don't know how much time we just used for that, but she's muted, so
no, that's great. No, that's great. I always think that looking at work first really helps us to try to understand the thinking that goes behind it. So I'm really pleased that Mr. Chisnell had a video so we could see kind of where he went. I do have some slides. I'm really looking forward to this because when I inherited TOK, the students were already past this, so I haven't seen this live. So I'm grateful to see some of the video from Mr. Chisnell's class, and there are other models on the IB website, which I will make available to you.
We'll post a few.
Yeah, as we go. But I want this to be your own. One thing I like about this, a lot of times presentations have this very orderly, here's your thesis, boom, boom, prove it, prove it, prove it. And it's very systematic. When I think of this, I think of like very loosely connected fabric that you start pulling apart issues and it'll lead to other places. So it sort of takes this different direction that I think is really fascinating. And when Mr. Chisnell was describing the process, he kept saying, and maybe, and maybe, and maybe. And I think that's a great way to think of the direction, because it's you exploring, and maybe we haven't considered this element, and maybe we haven't considered this element. It's not about a final conclusion. It's really about exploring the ways of knowing, or using a couple areas of knowledge maybe to really understand your issue. I am going to share a couple documents. Do you feel pretty comfortable? Scale of 10, show me fingers. Like, how well would you say you get the gist of the assignment? What it's supposed to be out of 10? Okay, good. Those are good numbers. I like that for this stage of the game. Oh, Mr. Chisnell's are kind of low, but I'll fill them in later. No worries. All right, let me show you a couple documents. Hold on one second. All right. So we did this, right? We looked at Matt's presentation and we thought, what do the objectives seem to be? So I'm going to have you look. This is just from the our guide, our TOK guide. And these are the assessment objectives. Like I said before, there are two big assessments, presentation and essay. And we'll get into the essay later, but they're sort of mirror images in some ways of one another. At any rate, here are the objectives: identifying and analyzing the various kinds of justifications. We've done some of that work. Formulate, evaluate, and attempt to answer knowledge questions. It's really the crux of the whole class. Examining how academic disciplines or areas of knowledge generate and shape knowledge. And I'm understanding the roles played by ways of knowing, explore links between knowledge claims, knowledge questions, ways of knowing, and areas of knowledge, demonstrating an awareness and understanding of different perspectives, and then exploring a real life situation. So this is really where the presentation comes from. All of these objectives will be hit if you are presenting a good TOK presentation. So it's not the same as an essay. A TOK presentation is internally assessed, which means your teachers assess them. So we just reported our scores, and there's a form that goes along with it where we describe to IB what your RLS was, what your knowledge questions are, but we don't actually submit generally a video. Although in the current state of affairs, I won't be surprised if they ask us to do that. I think either way, I will videotape you just so we have a way to verify your work and your thinking. So you select one real life situation, which Mr. Chisnell already said, and then you extract a knowledge question from that. This is, again, teacher's marks. This is the only one that I want to make sure. The TOK presentation is not a presentation on a subject specific issue. So it's related to real life situations. Yeah. All right. And then finally, I wanted you to take a minute and let's look at the rubric, particularly the top level, because let's just shoot for the top level. I don't really want to spend too much time thinking about how to shoot for the middle. So let's just take a minute or two, read this, and then let's think about what that means. So Anna, I can't see any of you, but I'm just calling out names. Anna, can you give me one element of this that pops out to you? One sort of takeaway looking at level 5 that you would want to think about as you develop your TOK presentation? Any one element?
I guess that like the knowledge question has to be specifically connected to the real life situation, and it has to be like clearly connect. Or did I just say that? I don't know.
Yeah. Yes. Oh. So the connection needs to be clear. Yep.
Yeah.
How about Victoria? Can you give me another look for as we head into our presentations?
I had looked at level 4 and 5, and I just kind of noticed the difference between reaching 5 with effectively explored versus just explored, clear versus convincing arguments, acknowledgement of the perspectives versus investigations, just kind of more advanced, I guess.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Emma, what's a takeaway for you?
I was looking at the characteristics in the bottom.
Okay, they're usually hilarious, but yes.
Yeah. And I don't know what discerning means. Like, So I don't know how to go from there. And I was also looking at the word sophisticated and the word lucid and trying to figure out how those two apply.
Yeah.
Anyone want to speak to that? I'm going to give you a official definition of discerning. So
I'm enacting discerning right now. That's someone who's discerning. It helps if you have.
I can imagine what your face is. So it says distinguishing, well, it's just discern, distinguish someone or something with difficulty by sight or with other senses. She could faintly discern the shape of a skull. So it's being able to distinguish, perceive, or recognize.
Okay.
Especially in terms of details and particulars. Someone who's discerning notes things that most people may miss. Yeah.
And then how does sophisticated and lucid apply?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know you know the word sophisticated, but maybe not in this context. So somebody, why don't you take I haven't heard from you, Tyler, in a few. Tell us, what do you think? You know what sophisticated means in some contexts, but let's try to think about what that means in this context.
It's probably like an advanced level of thinking, going about the different ideas that you have to wrestle with in a more complex manner, other than saying that a dog has fur. You take that idea, but you add more to it, and you really build on the idea rather than going with one blanket statement.
Thank you.
Actually, the follicle structure of a dog, depending upon its breed, determines whether or not it's hypoallergenic. That gets something closer to sophistication.
So there's certain language that you use that could make it more sophisticated, certain level of detail. Is that fair to say?
Yep.
And then what about lucidity? Do any of you know that word lucid? It's really just about how understandable it is. It's how clearly it's expressed.
Yep.
I just have to point you to the lower levels, the formless and incoherent. It's so cruel.
Yeah.
I really don't want to mark any of you at that level, so please don't make me. Derivative. Just wow, these are really pretty unflattering terms.
Incoherent is nice.
Yeah. Just this babble.
Even the 5 or 6 is an insult to most of us in the room. It's acceptable. Yeah. It's adequate.
Predictable. I knew it.
Mean. Just mean. Yeah. A totally predictable presentation. Thanks.
Right. So let's not do that. Let's shoot much higher. I could go for a level 4, but of course, level 4 or 5 would be what we should be working toward.
Well, I'll point out that a lot of the ways that you get to those levels come from some investment and some research. There is no specific requirement that the presentation have research. But you should by now be thinking that any task you take on that requires knowledge and sophistication probably requires some research, and that research should therefore be documented.
Absolutely. So if so, then you'll have a bibliography that you submit either separate from a presentation, or if you create some kind of slideshow, you could put it in there. I think so, right? There's no restriction on that.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
It just has to be available somewhere.
Okay. All right. Let me see what else we have. Oh no, I think that's it. All right. So Mr. Chisnell, as he approached this last semester, he, well, we have about 10 minutes, so we are going to need to think together, but, and maybe the brainstorming can happen sort of as homework and we could come back next week. Again, Mr. Chisnell and I have to make that decision, but what do you think, Mr. Chisnell? Do you want to, can I show sort of your thinking with your practice? He decided to really be able to understand it. He wanted to sort of design one himself so he could see where the complications are. And then,
that's a nice way of saying I wanted to experience the same trauma that they were going to experience.
Yes, it's good of him, isn't it? And then from that, he learned some things, and so he created some outline tips. Do you think it would be helpful at this time to just sort of talk through your process a little bit, Mr. Chisnell?
Yeah, we could do that. That's totally fine.
Okay, you just, I will drive and you just tell me when to switch slides. How about?
Oh, okay, you've got this somewhere, I guess.
Oh, I thought I linked it. Oh, just to save steps.
Because I will admit that I don't have up. Oh, there it is.
I have it, see?
Oh, okay. So I don't, might be more helpful to have my doc rather than the slides. But a couple of things I'll note that I had, if we just go to the second slide real fast.
Okay.
The first thing I did is made sure that my knowledge question was absolutely blisteringly clear for my audience. And I had that smack in front of me all the time while I prepped. And we'll see what if it shows up here at all. My presentation's got a lot of images in it and GIFs and things, so that's what slowed it down, of course. But as you can see, anyway. But I was concerned about Fortnite dances. That's where my RLS began. Is that if you know anything about the controversy, of course, Fortnite is starting to provide dances that have been the property, in particular, of minorities who have perfected that move. Some of them being celebrities, some of them YouTube stars. And it got me thinking, you know, the question is, there's an ethical line that's crossed. Your cultural appropriation is terrible. You can't just steal someone else's, you know, creative work or their cultural image or identity and call it yours. And for Fortnite to do it and make money, that's awful. Well, everyone's been arguing about that, you know, for the last 2 or 3 years. But then I asked the knowledge question this way. On what basis might we know we've crossed an ethical line? Notice what's important about the knowledge question here, and this is the thing that I really wrestled with. My job isn't to weigh in on Fortnite dances. Fortnite dances are a way for me to figure out my knowledge question. And that knowledge question is about how I know I've crossed an ethical line or not. On what basis do I make that decision? So take a couple of different perspectives here for a moment. And if you were me designing a presentation on this argument, what different perspectives might weigh in on this question? Who would have something to say about it? What would they say? Don't hesitate this time. We only have a few minutes. Let's drop in for a minute. Who do you imagine have something to say on this question?
I think the company or whoever's like doing this, whoever's creating something from someone else's culture, I think that they would have something to say about it because they might say, okay, well, we thought this was a really good idea and we wanted to make it into something else. And then, of course, you have the minority groups who might be offended by this and saying, well, you took my whatever, you took my dance, you took my art, you took whatever. So I think that you have a conflict there that you could apply to this.
Absolutely. If I missed those two perspectives, if I missed one of those in my presentation, I'd really be unjust in pursuing this. But more specifically to Allie's point, how would each of those perspectives answer the question of knowledge? We know what Fortnite's going to say on the cultural appropriation question. They've already weighed in on interviews. We know what the YouTube stars say. They've already told us in countless YouTube videos. So what's interesting is how they justify or explain that crossing of the line. On what is this ethics based? And that gets harder. That gets the rest. That's the knowledge question part, right? If all you do in your presentation is answer the RLS, you're doing what's called second order questioning. You're really at the surface level of the RLS. We want to get to something that's really about knowledge. And in that case, you're absolutely right. Those two perspectives have got to be there. Can you think of anyone else who might have a perspective on ethics here that would want to weigh in on this? A third perspective. This gets tougher. And now if I remove the RLS from this that's hidden in this question and stay with the idea, how, on what basis do we know we've crossed an ethical line of any kind? Then I start thinking, what do you mean legally or morally or spiritually? And are those different? Are ethics the same or different in terms of those three frameworks? And that might be something I end up pursuing as well, trying to understand that question. Ms. Barnett, if you could go another, I think it's a couple of slides. I don't remember what's on here.
Okay, I've got all kinds of little guys.
Yeah, I know. I was having a good time. So I have the power dynamic and what's important there to the dominant group. We'll keep going. Let's grab something here at the end. I have some examples, and I'm sorry that the multimedia is pretty important here. Misha Johnson and others. Yeah, African Elephant Raiders, Elvis Presley, and of course Katy Perry live at the AMAs. Decides to do this dance, and you have to start thinking, is that cultural appropriation or is that honoring the culture? And who gets to decide?
I don't want you to see that.
That's okay.
Sorry.
That's okay, but I don't know. You got all kinds of exciting things up there.
Oh, here we go. Sorry.
I think the part of that question is also who gets to have the decision. Is it the person whose culture it is who gets to decide that? And there might be some money issues involved or something like that. I'd have to see.
Sorry.
That's all right. So, and then I looked at history and how we decide that, because history changes. And how do we decide? You know, are we looting cultures for profit like we were in Africa? Is it the same thing, only symbolically now? But is that the same kinds of grounds for ethical decisions? Can I look at, for instance, Christopher Columbus or any of these other historical figures and say they are ethically wrong? And there's my history class, my DP history class weighing in on what's the term I'm using for that. If I'm using my own ethics to apply to history, there's a word for that. But it might be an historiocentric, it's an ethnocentric bias of some kind. But presentism, I think, is what it is, where we take our present ethics and apply them to history and thus point our accusing fingers. So if I can't point my accusing fingers across history, can I point them across cultures? Am I allowed to do that? And how does that decide? So these are all questions that I'm wrestling with. Guess what? I can't do all of those questions in 10 minutes. There's just too many. And if I want to get to that level 4 or 5, the sophisticated complex arguments we were talking about, I've got to limit or frame my questions really carefully. Decide what it is I can reach and what I can't. Otherwise, it's all over the place. What I discovered, this was my first TOK presentation, and the thing I discovered as I went through this and tried all these things out was that it was far too big. Either one, I was going to spend at least 20 minutes presenting it, or two, I was going to cover all the ideas too quickly. So one of the tricks I would say to you is whatever you choose and whatever you wrestle with, bring it in. Go deep in a small area of RLS rather than massively with a giant issue that you really want to wrestle with. I'd far rather you wrestle with the quadratic equation and its ethics than to try to take on, something like political correctness in general. I had one student last year took on feminism, and it's far too, it's huge. You can't get your head around that, and there's 1,000 places to go there. Which wave? Fourth wave? Post wave? Who knows? But we never got there because everything was covered so quickly. So we want to get down to what you can cover in 10 minutes thickly. So I guess our challenge is, as we pull the class here to an end, we need to choose an RLS of some kind, it sounds like, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 in your head, and start playing with them a little bit to see what knowledge questions you might get. The more specific your RLS, the better. The more accurate, how do I want to say this? The more crafted your knowledge question is, the better. By crafted, as Ms. Barnett said before, it shouldn't limit itself to one AOK. It should be applicable to many different areas of knowledge, but still relevant to the RLS that produced it. Thoughts, terrors, concerns. Nightmares. String art. No one has string art? Just checking. Who doodled something? Emma did.
Did you show us your notebook? Yeah, Emma always is.
She
doodling.
Doodled something.
Alea also.
Yeah.
Alea's a doodler.
That's a sign of a mind that needs to move quickly.
I doodled a lot.
Right. Now that she knows there's a compliment involved, she shows the doodles.
All along there.
Yeah.
I do a lot.
I think
it's a problem.
I think it means your mind is moving. So I
don't
never
know
take offense to that. Some teachers see, well, whatever, just go with it, because I've had students go, sorry, when I catch them doodling, and I think I'm okay with that as long as you're hearing what we're doing. All right. So next week, what we were thinking is maybe we could share some more some ideas that other people have done, share some RLS that maybe you're starting to think about, and getting closer to sort of a proposal of where you want to go. There is this form that we'll have to fill out, and we have to have official interactions. So it may be something like this summer we set up a time and we get together. I know you've done that with some of your other teachers for some of your other DP classes, where you start to think about your initial ideas. And so I'll be able to coach you a little bit, and or probably more than anything, just prompt you to think about things in different ways. So next week we'll kind of get into more of the planning phase, and like I said, we'll maybe share some others' ideas so you could see the variety. I mean, there's such a wide spectrum of what is possible with this presentation.
Yep.
Does that sound like a plan?
Where do you find an
To you?
RLS? Everywhere.
Yeah. TOK is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You may want to go back to some of your journals, but also just kind of think about what could be really interesting to spend, I hope, quite a bit of time thinking about, and then sharing that exploration with us in the fall.
Yep.
All right.
All of you are doing
Okay,
TED
folks,
Cruz.
I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And yes, Ted Cruz as your RLS.
Everybody.
Did all of you see him getting his hair cut the other day? Did you see that? Yes, he was getting his hair cut and calling his hair cutter a true patriot. All right. So I would love to, yes, I'm going to wish you a happy weekend, and I will see you next week.
Okay. See ya.